Hello everyone. Now you will hear a brief retelling of the movie Farpost. The tape is based on real events. In 2006, the U.S. Army deployed a series of farposts in northern Afghanistan to fight the Taliban and cut off arms shipments from Pakistan. The Keating outpost was located in a remote valley and surrounded by mountains on all sides. Because of this, the base was a death trap for the soldiers. The reinforcements that arrived wondered why it was not placed on top of a mountain. The Taliban constantly attack this outpost and get away without any problems. That's where this morning began. The troops are being fired on with machine guns and RPGs. The Americans return fire with mortars and machine guns. If only Salaga hadn't gotten confused and brought the right ammunition. Mortarmen hit the target exactly, the enemy was destroyed. After the battle, Sergeant Martin smacked one soldier for shooting right over his head, and Carter just now brought the right ammunition and got a slap on the wrist for arguing during the battle. Turns out everyone got excited early. One of the fighters had his entire face blown off by shrapnel. Captain Keating reprimands Faulkner for dabbling in illegal substances. There are only 54 of them here and they have to be sure of everyone. Faulkner gets a final warning and is demoted to private. The Americans want to establish relations with the local population, so they meet with Afghan elders. To inspire appropriate trust, the captain removed his body armor and helmet. The elders don't understand what is required of them. The military has been like this here for 40 years. Many of those present had participated in the recent attack. Keating suggested that the Afghans lay down their arms. Then the population will get money from the U.S. for construction and various projects. Otherwise, they will act in a bad way. The old man nodded to the young men. And they laid down their AKs in front of the captain. It seems that the Americans' conditions were accepted. But the next day Avampo was shelled again. There are enough internal problems. Younger stole a picture of the sergeant's wife and now has to apologize for showing her his wiener. The command has given a mission to deliver a truck to another base, and the local roads are more dangerous than the Taliban. It's easy to go off a cliff and fly off a cliff into the abyss. Captain Keating wanted to drive the truck himself. There was movement up ahead. Carter and Clint went to check it out. It turned out to be just a chicken. But while they were walking, the ground under the truck crumbled, and it fell off the cliff and exploded. Keating was in the cab, and the captain died of his wounds. The boys fired their rifles a few times, honored the commander's memory, and returned to duty. Captain Oleskos was appointed the new commander. He learned that there was not even a refrigerator to store blood, if someone urgently needed a transfusion, and save them mortars, only they reached the ridge. The new captain was welcomed in Afghans. He immediately sent subordinates to patrol the area, only now Clint fully realized that the Taliban have them as in the palm of his hand. If he were the enemy, Clint would first destroy the mortar point, then the armored vehicles and the warehouse, finished by blowing up the generators, so that it was impossible to call for help on the radio, and then already sent the fighters to take the camp. Sergeant Kirk noticed that a local man was taking pictures of their base on his cell phone. He was caught up, restrained and interrogated. It was the elders who gave the guy money to take pictures of the camp. Oleskos is going to keep him and investigate. The elders aren't happy, they haven't been given the money yet and they're already kidnapping children. But Oleskos once again showed the contracts for school construction and assured the council that he wants peace. Griffin advised the captain not to anger the elders. When they are happy, shelling is much less frequent. Muhammad, the interpreter, said the Taliban were on their way here with a larger army, but the Americans laughed him off. They are already surrounded by the Taliban and they attack them every day. In general, no one took Muhammad's words seriously. During a patrol, the soldiers needed to cross a river on a suspension bridge. Captain Oleskos stepped on the explosives and was mortally wounded. Private Junger, who was walking next to him, miraculously survived. Almost swallowed a piece of the captain's brain, though. Junger has PTSD and sits with his rifle in his hand talking to himself. Sergeant Klein walked over to him and took the magazine out of the rifle for good measure. Junger never regained consciousness, so he was taken away on an air ambulance helicopter along with the commander's body. As soon as the new Captain Broward arrived, he announced that the outpost would be closed in July. His subordinates showed him an Afghan ID card they found by the bridge. Apparently, this is their bomber. He must be found and captured. But Broward told him not to go AWOL and provoke the local population. During the next shelling, Broward was again in trouble. He refused to give the order to fire mortars until the soldiers clearly saw the gunmen with weapons. Allegedly, there is a risk that civilians could be harmed. Then Clint learns that the current president of Afghanistan has asked to keep the outpost open until the election, so it won't be closed for the time being. The strange captain only pees in bottles and makes the privates throw them into a waste pit. Carter suspects he's just scared, afraid to go outside. Even when he goes to take a shit, he takes his escort with him. Lieutenant Bunderman tells him that 2 other captains died at this outpost before Keating and Alaska's, so Broward is understandable. Soon the Taliban acquired mortars, and since they were firing at night, they had night vision. Broward ordered a white phosphorus response, and so the next day, the elders approached the outpost. The daughter of an Afghan had been killed by white phosphorus. The body already stinks badly. Sergeant Kirk realizes they're being set up. And then there's the warrior dog that bit the elder. It's not that simple. A dog bite is highly dishonorable in our culture. They want you together. Broward shot the dog and reprimanded Private Cruz for fiddling with the animal. Some time later, the cowardly captain announced that he had been removed from his post and the outpost would close on October 6. October. Captain Portetz would come here, and in the meantime Lieutenant Banderman would be in charge. It was October 3, 3 days before the outpost closed. At dawn, Muhammad came running and began to shout that the Taliban army is already here, all the villagers have left the village. But the Afghan says this every week, so even now no one took his words seriously. However, it was enough to look through binoculars and see hundreds of armed men descending the slopes of the mountain. Everyone who was still asleep woke up to the sounds of mortar fire. A machine gunner is working on the Taliban. His life was saved by a sturdy helmet that protected his head from the bullet. It is important to get to the mortars, but the Americans are under heavy fire from machine guns and RPGs. Sergeant Thompson was wounded. A comrade tried to drag him to safety, but several more explosions sent him to the other side. All of the Afghan soldiers immediately fled. Some fighters managed to get to machine guns and Humvees, but they soon ran out of ammunition. This time Scarter better not make a mistake and bring the right ones. Kirk grabbed a grenade launcher, but before it could be fired, he was knocked over by an explosion and a bullet flew into his head. A medic with a stretcher ran across the base to render him aid. His wife and daughter are waiting for him at home, and now he has to get ammunition to the Humvee, but as soon as he ran out of the room, he was shot in the head, and there was nothing he could do. Due to bad weather, the Apaches would not arrive until 40 minutes later. The machine gun on one of the Humvees exploded and went out of service. After gathering his courage, Carter ran to the armored vehicle with a bunch of ammo. He was almost covered by the explosion several times, so the guy was not happy to find out that the machine gun was no longer working. A lot of fighters were trapped inside the armored vehicle. Clint tried to cover them and secure their retreat, but after being hit with an RPG, he was wounded in the arm and the machine gun was destroyed. The sergeant returned to headquarters and learned that Kirk had passed away. The infirmary was filled with wounded and the rest of the fighters were still being threatened by the sniper that killed Scusa. Clint grabbed his rifle, figured out the sniper, and finished him off. The 3 fighters wanted to get their comrades out by driving up to them in another Humvee, but at some point the car hit an obstacle and couldn't move any further. Now they had to get to shelter themselves, but by then, the Taliban had already infiltrated the base. 2 of them were supposed to run while the third one would cover them with a machine gun, but something went wrong. The Taliban thought they had already won, and Clint punished the 3 cocky bearded men. The lieutenant was going to command a retreat, but Clint wants to recapture the base. Otherwise, the stranded fighters will die. The same ones tried to save themselves. They jumped out of the vehicle and were immediately covered by a barrage of fire. Galagas dragged his wounded comrade around the corner to safety, but the Taliban were already waiting for them. The two survivors had to go back to the car. Clint recruited volunteers to repel the camp and moved forward. A wounded Mays slumped on the ground not far from the vehicle. Though he is in cover, Carter is worried that the private will bleed out. Clint and his squad make it to the first Humvee. The Taliban are already walking around the base like they are at home. Carter managed to convince Lars to help the wounded Mays, and he began to cover him. Carter bandaged the wounded leg, picked up the fighter, and carried him to the vehicle. Clint saw that a whole crowd of Taliban were coming down the mountain toward them. He fired his underbarrel grenade launcher at them, and the damage was much worse than the sergeant had expected. In fact, it was the Apaches who flew in, and with a couple of volleys, they blew the crowd apart. The wounded Mays was already losing consciousness from blood loss. Carter realized he had to act and ran to reconnoiter. When he returned, Lieutenant Bunderman had already contacted them. A bomber will be here soon to clean up the mess, so the three of them need to get out of here and hide in the sanitarium. The wounded Mays was put on a stretcher and carried to safety. At the same time, the bombing started. Carter did everything to save a battle buddy, and running to the sanitary unit, exhausted fell to the floor. But Mace is on the verge, and it is not yet known whether he will survive. Some time later, not far from the base, landed Captain Portas with Special Forces. He saw a destroyed outpost and the backs of fleeing Taliban. Apaches flew in to finish them off. The soldiers went around the base to find the hidden militants, but in the toilet they found a frightened Muhammad. By evening all the bodies had been found. 7 dead, 27 wounded, 12 of them in serious condition. During the night, the wives of the killed Afghan soldiers came to the base. An evacuator flew in to take all the seriously wounded. Mays had blood transfused from several soldiers to get him to the operating room. Carter walked him out and wished him luck. The next day, helicopters picked up the rest of the soldiers as well. They were informed that Mays had passed away after all. The Keating outpost had been destroyed before their eyes. After the experience, Carter, more than anyone else, needed psychological help. Carter, thinking only of the fact that he had not saved Mays, he could no longer utter a single word and became hysterical. After the battle for Kamdash, it was decided to close all outposts unfit for defense. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to give us likes.